kept touching her, and then taking.
And so one reason that might be good is that they will use weird new human introduced food sources, right? So things like crows. And these urban adapted species are also relatively bold. So they stop interpreting humans as a threat, as predators, right? And so they live right alongside humans. And even though they might not be a species that you typically think of as one that lives in cities to the extent of like pigeons and things like that, the species in which I study this idea is the Northern Cardinal. Okay, so there's going to be a few that pop up on the bird feeder right behind us while we're talking here. They're all over Rice Creek, but they also get into urban areas pretty readily, right? People's backyards, they're in city parks. They are one of these species that seem to coexist alongside humans in urban areas relatively well, okay? And so one of the first projects that I worked on with my students here was one to look at the behavior of cardinals in the city versus the country and ask, are their behaviors any different? Are there things about the way cardinals are behaving when they're in cities that may allow them to thrive in those urban areas? And so that's where Rice Creek comes in. We are not in an urban area, right? But Rice Creek serves as a great sort of rural control to compare against an urban area. There's cardinals all throughout Rice Creek. This is a relatively natural, undisturbed area for them, right? Which I'll call the rural area. And then my students and I also work in Berry Park down in Syracuse. Many of you are familiar with the sort of Syracuse University area of the city down there. There's this great old park that's smack dab right in the middle of all this urban development. And there are also cardinals all throughout that park. Okay, so we study the cardinals at these two sites and compare all sorts of things about them. One thing we came up with doing was an experiment to test these behaviors. So these behaviors of fear of new things and boldness. What my students and I did was we found all the cardinals that we could here at Rice Creek and down there at Berry Park, and we gave them nice, beautiful bird feeders in the middle of their territories. So we found a male's territory, we put color bands on him so we could follow him and know who he was for the whole extent of the study, and we put a bird feeder right on his platform. So we got on his territory. So he got used to a nice free food being right in the middle of his territory. Then after a couple of days of them getting used to this nice free food, we challenged them with these novel objects. So we put these weird things on their feeders, different colored frisbees and rulers, just as random objects that we found. And we looked to see how long it took them to get up the courage to come back to their bird feeder after this weird thing had been placed on it. Okay, so we did that with the Rice Creek birds and the birds down in Berry Park. And we also, once they were foraging at their feeder, one of my students developed this protocol where they would test how close they could get to the bird before it would fly away. And that's us measuring how bold they are, how fearful are they of humans or not. And we measure that with what's called flight initiation distance. So how close can you get to an animal before it flies away from you? Okay, so if we do those two things together, we can get an idea of neophobia and boldness at Rice Creek and Berry Park. And here's what we found. I'll show a couple of figures here and there that aren't too complicated. I'll walk you through them. We have the urban birds down in Berry Park in purple, and the rural birds here in Rice Creek in orange. Now on the y-axis there is how close we were able to get to them before they would fly away. That's their flight initiation distance. Okay? And as you can see, the urban birds let you get much closer to them before they'll fly away. Okay? You can get about twice as close to a bird down in the city as you can to a bird here at Rice Creek. And the birds here are much more fearful of humans. They'll fly away more than you get anywhere near as close to them as the urban birds down in Berry Park. Okay? What about how the birds responded to all these weird things that we put on their bird feeders? Okay? So again, we have the birds down in Berry Park. The urban birds here are in purple. Okay? And the birds here at Rice Creek are in orange. And on the y-axis here is how long it took them to get up the courage to come back to their bird feeder. Okay, that's called latency. Okay, so way up high on the y-axis, it's taking them like 5 minutes to get up the courage to come back to their bird feeder. Okay, in response to all the weird things that we showed. Okay, and so what you'll notice is for the birds down in the city, all of them are clustered down far here on the y-axis. It takes them much less time to get up the courage to come back to their bird feeder, okay? And they come back just as quickly as if you put nothing there. So here is a control where we didn't put any weird thing with the bird feeder. We just flushed them off the bird feeder and wait for them to come back. They come back just as quickly if you put a weird yellow ruler or blue frisbee or something there, compared to if there's nothing there at all. Okay, the birds here at Rice Creek, if you put these weird things on their bird feeder, it takes them forever to get up the courage. They hop up to it, they look at it, they hop back into the bushes. They have this neophobia. They have something going on in the way that they interpret these weird things that makes them fearful. And that could be something that would not allow you to be successful in an urban area. Okay? Whereas these cardinals that live down in the city, they don't care. They see frisbees and rulers and all sorts of weird things all the time. It doesn't really affect them. Okay. And so this is sort of what we found, right? That these urban birds are older and less afraid of new things, right? Birds here at Rice Creek. And so we're asking a couple follow-up questions related to this. One of the things that we're interested in is this a very quickly changing behavior? So if you took a cardinal from Rice Creek and drove it down the road to Berry Park, right, and let it get used to living in the city, could it change its behavior very quickly? Or is this a genetic change? Is this a representation of like a genetic evolution happening to this population? We don't really know. So there's all sorts of things we want to follow up on to explore these behavioral experiments. And a couple of different types of experiments we want to do. One thing is challenging the birds with different food as well. So giving them some things that are a little more relevant to their sort of success rather than just showing them weird objects, giving them weird new food to forage on and seeing how they would respond. So we have some experiments in the work to follow this. And another project that came out of this cardinal research comparing the Syracuse birds to the birds here was related to how they communicate with each other. So we know that's another way that urban living is disrupting birds and other animals, changing the way that they can communicate with each other. So research like that on humpback whales, okay, in shipping lanes right off the coast of major cities, has demonstrated that the noise pollution that's in the ocean disrupts the way these whales communicate with each other. And there's all sorts of really cool bird research on this topic as well, typically also related to the way they sing and talk to each other acoustically, okay? And we know that all the urban noise that exists in cities messes with the way birds can sing to each other. There's a really cool experiment that came out of the Bay Area out in San Francisco that studied these white-crowned sparrows at the height of the shutdown, right? So all this incredible traffic going, all around San Francisco, all of a sudden reverted to like 1950s levels, right? It was almost completely negated. And the birds responded by singing in a completely different way once they were free from all that anthropogenic noise. They were able to sing more quietly to be able to be heard. They didn't have to sing loud and make themselves heard over all that traffic noise. They change the frequency at which they sing. But what we know a lot less about where the cardinals come in is how visual communication is affected by living in the city, right? So birds sing a lot, they talk to each other, but they're also very colorful. They use their plumage to communicate with each other. And the cardinals are a great system to look at this in because we know they have these bright signals that they use to talk to each other. Males in particular, right, are bright red. Even the females, if you look closely at them, have some interesting color going on. They have these beautiful pink patches in their wings. And there's previous research that showed that, and even the orange of their bills are all signals that they use to talk to each other. They get information out of looking at the color of those different patches. And the other thing that's really cool about cardinals is the color that they put into their plumage and into their bills comes from a pigment that they have to eat. It's not a pigment that they can make themselves in their body. Okay, these in birds, yellows and oranges and reds are made by a pigment that's called carotenoids, and only plants make carotenoids. Animals can't make them themselves. So if birds want to make themselves red, they have to eat those pigments in their food and then put it into their feathers. And so if something goes wrong with either the food they have access to or the way that they process those pigments inside their body, it can change their color. So every now and then these weird yellow cardinals pop up and the birders go crazy to try and find them because they're interesting, weird plumage. And that's because these carotenoid pigments have become messed up.
What about the white? You ever heard of the white cardinals?
White, lots of species can aberrantly, sort of incorrectly turn white occasionally. Those are usually genetic mutations, genetic deficiencies in the way they put down their pigments.
I wonder if they, I guess.
Oh no, those are very rare. Yeah, a lot of birds will show whites where they're not supposed to. Usually if they're supposed to be black or brown, so when birds put melanins, like the same pigments that are in our skin, into their feathers, if something goes wrong with that, the way that that works, they can come across as white. And so we were interested in looking at these city and country birds and seeing if they look different, okay, if their visual signals were being disrupted in any way. Are they eating different things, right, in these very, very different habitats that can mess with the color that they're able to use to communicate to each other? So we looked at this in males and females, okay, we have this beautiful pink underwing patch in the females. We take photographs to quantify that. We take photographs of the bills to quantify that color. And then we take feather samples back to the lab and analyze the color of the feather samples. And so we can get these very objective measurements of the color of the feather, like how saturated is it? Is it a really deep, pure color or a sort of a more reduced color? Is it a very bright color? Is it a very dark color? And it's important to be very careful about the way we do this because birds have a very different visual system than humans do. Does anybody know anything about this? Anybody know anything about the way birds see the world and how it's different from how we see the world? The main difference is that birds have access to ultraviolet light. Okay, so they can see a much wider spectrum of colors than we can. We have 3 photoreceptors in our eyes that are sensitive to colors, 3 cones in our eyes. Birds have a 4th cone. So if you look at the electromagnetic spectrum of all the different colors that somebody could see, we have these 3 cones, and we can see blues, and we can sort of see some greens and yellows to reds. Birds have a 4th cone that allows them to get into ultraviolet light that we cannot see at all. And they also have much better discrimination of their colors. So they can see more colors and they can see the colors better than we can. And so when we do our measurements of color, we take that into account. We are quantifying these colors as the birds are perceiving. And so here's one of the weird things that we found. So the first 3 years that we did this study, 2019, 2020, and 2021, And if we looked at the color of our male plumage, something weird happened in 2020, where our birds here at Rice Creek were much oranger than they were in the other 2 years. Something was happening with what they were able to eat. But if we checked our birds down in Berry Park, they were red, 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 fire engine red every single year. Something happened to them in this year that allowed them to stay just as red as they were supposed to when something happened that turned our Rice Creek birds a little more orange than they were supposed to. On the y-axis here is orange birds down here. And we also found patterns in some of the other color patches that we looked at where the urban birds were redder, more saturated than the birds here. In some cases across all the years that we did the study. So every year that we looked at our cardinals, the males down in Berry Park always had redder bills than the males here. Males here had relatively orange bills, the ones down there had very red bills. And if you look at that beautiful underwing patch of the females, the Berry Park females, their wings are super, super saturated. It's beautiful, almost like a red. And the females here are a much duller, kind of pinkish color. Question?
Is it right that the birds lose all their feathers in a year's time? It makes it totally new feathers, so that's why your colors can change like that?
Yes, they have to molt their feathers at least once a year. So that's the time when they can change their color. So if they're eating something at that time, when they're growing their new feathers, that's the opportunity to color.
So how long is that molting time?
It's pretty quick. Cardinals.
Why don't I find a lot more feathers where underneath my bird feeder?
Yeah, well, one reason is they don't drop all the feathers at once, right? So they molt them sequentially so they can still fly, for example. So sometimes during that season, you'll see birds flying. If you look closely, they'll be missing a few feathers. They'll be in the process of regrowing those feathers. And some birds molt multiple times throughout the year. Cardinals molt once at the end of the summer. So at that time, if our country birds and our city birds are eating different things, that's the opportunity for them to look different. And so the general pattern is, yeah, go ahead.
Oh, we have a regular cardinal at feeder. We can't decide if it is a male or a female. Maybe it's a trans cardinal. I don't know. Is that really uncommon? I haven't seen that.
One thing you might have is a very old female. Females, as they age, okay, it's related to hormone imbalance, they start to express some more masculine hormones, and they can start to become a little more male-like as they age. So that could be one thing that you're seeing. Sometimes you'll see a female that's really handsome, really beautiful, really colorful. It almost looks a little bit like a man. Probably a little bit.
Do they eat sumac?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
And that's part of their color comes.
Which we might come back to. Actually, keep that. That's an interesting observation. I think about what exactly they're eating. So the general pattern that we found, in some cases it was only 1 year, in other cases it was across the multiple years of our study. In general, the birds down in the city, more colorful, redder, deeper color, more beautiful plumage down in Berry Park, in the middle of the city, compared to out here at Rice Creek. Why would that be the case? Anybody have thoughts on how or why that would happen? Most people, if they find color differences, find the exact opposite. City birds, they're exposed to more stress, they're exposed to toxins, maybe, they're exposed to pollutants, their color gets diminished, okay? These birds down there are beautiful, more beautiful than the birds here. How could that possibly be?
Do they have more bird feeders in that area?
That's an interesting idea. Why do you think that would be?
Different food. If it's accessible with bird
We have a bird feeder here, right? But the birds in Berry Park, there's bird feeders in everybody's backyard, right? So if they're gorging on bird seed, maybe they're able to use the pigments in that bird seed to make themselves extra beautiful.
Maybe they have more predators in the rural. They camouflage themselves.
Maybe they're changing their color because of the predators that they're exposed to, right? That's a possibility. One thing we know about your bird seed idea is that probably doesn't hold up because they definitely have more access to bird seed down there than they do here, but the bird seed doesn't have these pigments. It has some fats, it has some oils, it has some things that they can use, but it's pretty efficient in those nice pigments. So if you eat exclusively bird seed, you're actually probably going to be less colorful. So it can't be that.
Some berries, maybe?
Dr. McElwain, putting forth the berry hypothesis. Go on.
So are there more trees with berries down in Berry Park?
There might not be more.
I might mean that as a joke. I just meant there's trees with berries. The berries are colorful, so they're getting the carotenoids from berries.
There might not be more, but one thing that there are more of in the city are invasive species. Okay, and so in particular, some of these honeysuckle species. There's invasive honeysuckle all throughout Rice Creek as well. You might be aware of, but there are a few native honeysuckles out here, and there's not as much of it as there is down in Berry Park. Okay, and this is a common phenomenon all throughout urban areas. People plant a lot of ornamental species that are invasive, or you have these invasives that have gotten established on their own. And cardinals will eat the heck out of these, especially at the end of the summer when they're molting, making their color. And it turns out that these have those carotenoid pigments ready to go. They have tons and tons of carotenoids in them. And the other thing that's interesting about them is that most carotenoid pigments that are out there in plants are actually yellow. So the birds, the cardinals, have to convert them physiologically from yellow into red. It's more difficult for them to do that. The carotenoids that are in these invasive honeysuckles are already red to begin with. So it's kind of like cheap, fast food. They eat the berries and put the red pigments directly into their plumage and their bills and make themselves extra attractive. The thing that's weird is that we looked at the health of the birds. The urban birds are in way poorer condition. They're skinnier, they have less fat. So they're suffering in a way from their body condition and their overall health, but they're able to make themselves look more beautiful because they're kind of cheating and they're getting access to this sort of cheap, fast food. That's a little bit different from what the birds at Rice Creek.
So how long do cardinals live?
Cardinal might live 6-7 years if it's lucky, something like that. Yep. But they're gonna have the opportunity to change their color every year, right? Depending on what they have access to. Yeah.
So we have a place in North Central Missouri we just come from, and the cardinals down there are smaller. We live in the city about the size of Syracuse, but the cardinals are smaller, and they have I wouldn't say a southern wall, but they have a very different wall than they do here.
Yep.
Do those? Why is that?
Yeah, one of the interesting things about species like this that are really widely distributed, and they also don't migrate. They're year-round residents. So species like that are distributed across really big geographical areas, kind of like humans develop dialects, right? It doesn't necessarily mean anything. It doesn't necessarily have an adaptive significance, but just the fact that they're so far apart from each other and they're isolated over time, they come to look and sound different for sort of random reasons. So we know that happens with cardinals and all sorts of other different species. So this phenomenon has been found in other species, things that can get extra red, redder than they usually are for this reason, because they can get access. This might be your female. Here's an example, actually, kind of a female that is a little redder than she's supposed to be. So the idea here is that this is like a very subtle way that humans might be messing with these poor cardinals. Yes, they're living in the city. They're doing just fine. They seem to have these behaviors that allow them to thrive in the cities, but we're actually kind of messing with the way they talk to each other. They're signaling something completely different down in the city than they are up here. This plumage has evolved to signal to mates, like, hey, I'm healthy, I'm a good mate, right? Down there in the city, they're kind of cheating the system. The whole thing is being thrown out of whack because of this weird food source that they have available.
But
yeah.
So despite these advantages that the urban cardinals might have, with being brighter and being bolder, they don't live as long?
That we don't know in these cardinals per se. In a lot of species, in the few species that's been looked at, the urban populations tend to live shorter lifespans than rural birds. So oftentimes they kind of totally change their life history. They reproduce at a faster rate to make up for the fact that they're not going to live as long. That's probably the case with the cardinals, but we haven't actually measured that ourselves. But it's a great point. The question is sort of, is it good or bad to live in a city, right? The fact that, you know, they're definitely different. There are things about them that are different, the way they behave, the way they look. Is that a good thing, right? They're sort of adapting, figuring out how to live alongside humans, or are they sort of suffering long term? We don't really know that. Yeah.
Just wondering about that you said that the condition of like rural birds tends to be a little better than urban birds.
Yeah.
And I was just wondering because there's been a lot of increase in people with feeding birds.
Mhm.
And a lot of people do tend to feed the black oil seed, which is, as you said, high in fat and
Yeah.
calories.
Yeah.
So would that impact that difference? Maybe the urban birds are not getting as much of the rich food.
Absolutely, and they probably have less access to insects, especially native insects, which are very important for them. They have protein, right? So they have food, but they don't have the diversity and quality of food that they have. Absolutely. So we're still working on this system. We're following up with a couple of other questions to sort of really figure out physiologically what's going on with these birds to sort of confirm some of these ideas. There's a few other projects in the urban, rural, cardinal larger project that I have students working on. I do have a student who is interested in this question of acoustic communication. So she's recorded the songs of the cardinals down in Berry Park and the ones here, and she's finding all sorts of interesting differences. They sing very differently. One of the things that she finds is that the cardinals in the city sing at a much higher frequency than the cardinals here. And that's a pattern that people have found previously because urban noise, traffic noise, and things like that tends to be low frequency. Think about what traffic noise sounds like. It's low frequencies. So the cardinals, in order to hear themselves above that noise, they have to sing louder, and they also have to shift the pitch of their song up into a higher frequency. And we find that in our cardinals as well. I have a student who's been interested in nests down there at Berry Park compared to here, and where the birds place their nests, what they make their nests out of, and how that affects whether they get found by predators or not. Turns out the nests down in Berry Park are really terrible. They nest in very exposed areas that are easy for predators to find. They incorporate a lot of trash into their nests, which negatively affects how successful the nests are. And so that's something we're trying to quantify to get at this question of sort of how are the two populations doing ultimately? Are the urban birds producing fewer babies and sort of replenishing the population at a lower rate than the birds here suspected? And I had a student who was a sort of a veterinarily minded student interested in diseases who developed a really wonderful project. Worked with Dr. McElwain on this, who's one of our sort of disease parasite experts here. So they really sort of came up with this project on their own. This student was interested in these blood parasites that the birds can get. A lot of birds around here, cardinals in particular, are susceptible to avian malaria. It's a blood parasite that attacks the blood cells and can have negative effects on the birds. And the disease is spread by different fly species. And what she did was we collected blood samples from a whole bunch of birds down at Berry Park and birds here, and she looked for evidence of these blood parasites. So they get into the red blood cells and disrupt the nucleus. You can see them in a microscope. They blow up the nucleus and change the shape of the cell. It has all sorts of negative consequences. She found this really interesting pattern where there's one strain of, type of avian malaria that is transmitted by black birds, okay? She found, and again, we're going to look at the birds, the urban birds versus the rural birds. The urban birds were overwhelmingly protected from avian malaria. The vast majority of them were uninfected, did not have avian malaria. The birds here at Rice Creek, most of them had avian malaria. This avian malaria is transmitted by black flies. If you know anything about black flies and where they like to live, they're forest bugs, right? If you go out in Rice Creek, in July, you're going to get bit by black flies, right? If you're down in Berry Park, you're not. They like fast flowing, relatively clean water. That's where they breed. They're not going to be in the middle of the city. There's all stagnant water. So this is another interesting potential benefit of living down in the city. These birds get protection from this really nasty disease that's spread by these flies. So the moral of the story here with the cardinal is they're a really wonderful system to study. We're learning a lot about what is a very familiar backyard bird. When I started working here and I was considering developing a research project around cardinals, I was a little hesitant because I figured we must know everything there is to know about cardinals. They're common, they're colorful, they're easy to study, they're everywhere. But it turns out there's a lot of interesting work still to be done on these type of species, despite the fact that they're so common. So I want to switch from cardinals just to highlight a few of the other bird-related things we do around here. One thing you may or may not be aware of that we do here at Rice Creek, as of 2023, we operate a bird banding station. Okay, so this is where we set up these specialized nets in various places all throughout the trails, and we passively catch whatever birds come through. And we do this during spring and fall migration, so we're catching birds that are just passing through Rice Creek, sometimes for just a few days before they head up into Canada, for example, to breed. And we also do this throughout the summer, where we're monitoring the birds that are actually here at Rice Creek, breeding and making babies all throughout the summer. So we're collecting all sorts of wonderful data on, in some cases, the timing of birds that pass through Rice Creek. So these really short-term migratory visitors that might be coming from South America and headed up to Canada. When do they pass through Rice Creek? Right, you see them for 2 days in May. And if you went out birding for them, you'd be really hard pressed to find them. And catching them and banding them this way is one of the best ways to census. And then the birds that we study during the summer, this is a great way to track how healthy their populations are, how many babies are they producing year after year. And this is part of a huge network of banding stations all across North America. And all this data gets put into a big, gigantic database so people can do these really, really big analyses using these combined data sets of banding stations. And these are how we get all of these statistics that you read about in the news, like such and such bird, their population is declining, right? Or this species is recovering. Those type of data come from these type of efforts. So we're really excited to be able to contribute to that and develop all sorts of interesting new projects that have come from this banding station. Here's just a little sampling of kind of what it looks like there. Catch all sorts of interesting birds. We've captured and banded over 2,000 species here, birds, 70 different species. We've got 22 warbler species, which is kind of pretty amazing. You wouldn't necessarily think that 22 different warblers pass through Rice Creek. And there have been all sorts of interesting projects that have spun off of this banding station. A couple of students here at Oswego were collaborating with a microbiologist on the faculty who's interested in looking at the gut microbiomes of these birds. So all these birds that pass through Rice Creek, we take a little swab of their digestive tract, and we're looking at the microorganisms that they carry with them, in particular yeast. Turns out birds, their digestive tracts are all full of yeast species that people don't know anything about. And they serve as a great way of moving these yeast species all around the world. So they serve as a dispersal vector for yeast. And so that's something that we're studying. We've had a researcher from ESF who was collecting ticks off of our birds. Unfortunately, a lot of these birds, when you catch them, they're loaded up with ticks. And that makes them a potential vector for Lyme disease, which we know is a big problem around here. She's still in the process of sort of looking at these data, but it turns out a lot of these ticks that we pull off these birds are positive for Lyme. A lot of Lyme disease. And birds are contributing to spreading it around here. So more incentive, if you don't already need it, to be aware and conscious of ticks anytime you're out and about at Rice Creek or anywhere around here. We started a really cool recent project with some friends from UCLA. Remember a couple summers ago, we had these really extensive wildfires up in Canada, and the smoke was coming right across the lake, right down through here. We're using the birds that we catch at the banding station. We're looking at whether wildfire smoke disrupts the feathers of the birds, so the literal carbon that comes from the smoke. Turns out it gets embedded within the feathers, and it can degrade the feathers and change their color. So with wildfires becoming a bigger, ever increasing problem throughout the country, that's something people are interested in. And the big thing I wanted to highlight for you all is that the banding station is completely open to visitors. We really, really encourage any and everybody to come visit the banding station. If you're interested in this at all, send me an email, and I have a little list of people that that are interested in the banding station. Every time we're going to go out and band birds, we send an email out to the list a couple of days ahead of time so you can come out. And any level of involvement is welcome. If you want to learn how to handle some of these birds and do some of the actual work, or you just want to see some birds up close, whether you're a student, member of the public, whoever, it's completely open to everybody. And it's a really, really good time, really fun way to see some birds up close that you could never ever really see. Including in the last couple of years, we expanded our banding operations. Usually we're out in the morning catching the songbirds that are flitting around in the woods, and we do some nocturnal banding in the fall to target these owls. So we started owl banding. And this has been really cool. We target in particular this little guy, the Northern Saw-whet Owl. It's one of the smallest you can see compared to my hand. This owl is like the size of a coffee cup. Okay, most people have never seen this owl before. People know the great horned owl, maybe the barred owl. This is a migratory owl, so they come through. Most of them are breeding up in Canada, but they come through in fall and they zip back through in spring, and they're silent. They're out in the middle of the night. You almost never hear them. They're tiny. They're notoriously difficult to find. Birders go out looking for them and never ever find them. And it turns out we have loads of them at Rice Creek. We caught 67 of them this past fall. They're all throughout Rice Creek in the fall. You would never ever know they were there. We put our nets up, and our trick is that we play the owls, sound to them, and that lures them to come down and get captured in the nets. Otherwise, you would never hear them or see them. And so this is hopefully going to become an interesting project, looking at just how many owls are out there, the extent to which the owls use Rice Creek as a habitat. We're finding all sorts of interesting things, like tough to see on this illustration, but what I'm showing here is how many owls we catch as an effect of how bright the moon is. Okay, so this is the illumination of the moon increasing as you go along the x-axis. You catch way fewer owls on bright moonlit nights because they prefer to be out flying around foraging when it's darker. They can sneak up on their prey, and they're less vulnerable to predation themselves. Some of the bigger owls, like barred owls in particular, love to snap at these guys. So they love to be out only in the dark. And one really exciting thing is that we captured 3 owls that were banded at a different banding station. Okay? So that is like the gold standard, or the real prize of banding stations, is when either a bird that you've banded gets captured somewhere else, or you capture a bird that somebody else has banded. And now we're starting to get information on how these birds move around. Okay? And so we caught 3 owls that were banded. 2 of them were banded down in Pennsylvania, and 1 was banded down in Italy. Several years prior to when we caught them, so we get information about the age of the bird, how long they live, and what sort of migratory routes they follow. One of the things we're really interested in is the fact that we are located, as you know, right on the south shore of Lake Ontario, and there are banding stations up in Canada that band these owls on their shore. And people are very split on how these birds migrate around the Great Lakes. Some people think they fly straight across the lakes, and some people think they work their way around the lakes. And so we're hoping that we can contribute some information to that. If we can catch some owls that were banded by some of these stations directly across the lake, that'll help us give information, learn about whether they're willing to migrate straight across the lakes. And I'm just going to highlight one other quick interesting bird project we have here. All sorts of other things that my students are doing. I have a student who's been working on campus, putting up these automated recorders that record bird song. And he's been using those data to look at what birds use the campus property during migration. And again, finding this wonderful diversity of birds that stop over on campus during their migratory routes, especially in spring because of where we are on the south shore of the lake. It's a really, really important migratory stopover spot because the birds like to stop here, rest, refuel before they fly. So campus in particular, being right on the lake shore, is a great spot for migratory birds. But the last thing I want to highlight with a couple more slides is another project we're doing right up the road, at the top of the road here in the fields around the Fallbrook Lodge. It's studying this really interesting species called the bobolink. So I mentioned at the beginning when I was talking about bird declines, grassland species are one of the groups of birds that are in the most trouble. We don't have a lot of native grassland left, and especially in this part of the country, in the Northeast, there's not a lot of big patches of grassland, period. So we don't have a lot of grassland specialists in this part of the country. These bobolinks are a blackbird. They're a very close relative of the red-winged blackbird. And they will use, they'll show up in this part of the country a little bit, but they mainly are using agricultural fields. So we have very few real grassland patches still intact, but we have tons of hay fields and alfalfa fields and all this stuff. Bobolinks will show up, move into those grass fields. They'll nest in them, but they're a classic, what's called ecological trap, because they look like attractive, suitable habitat for the birds, and they're very much not. Because what happens is right around the time that these birds are producing babies, they're getting ready to fledge, the farmers come through and they harvest the hay or whatever else is in there. And in some cases, literally chop up the babies. It's the worst possible trap that they fall into. In the fields up here, all around Rice Creek, we're doing this very thing. The university used to lease those out to hay farmers, and they would harvest the hay there, and there were bobolinks in those fields. And this exact thing would happen to them. It was awful. It was terrible to watch. But a few years ago, we successfully lobbied the administration to stop leasing those fields out to the hay farmers and to allow us to manage the fields and study how they're being used by these birds. And so they no longer get harvested for hay, and the bobolinks are thriving. The bobolinks absolutely love this habitat. And so my students and I are working on the bobolinks out there, catching them as they arrive. These are long-distance migrants. They're coming from South America. The males and females really look dramatically different. That's the male with the little blonde, top of his head there. So we catch all the birds that come into these fields. We put color bands on them so we can track them and identify them. We take blood samples from them. And then we look for evidence of breeding. It turns out the birds are being really, really successful breeding in those fields. So we find the nest. The nest is really difficult to find on the ground underneath the grass. So my students have spent hours and hours out there watching the birds to try to find these nests. And so we find all the nests, band all the babies, and keep track of how productive these birds are being out there. And in the 2 years that we've done this study, we found a couple of really interesting things. There's about 4 or 5 territories that can pack in there. So about 4 or 5 different males. And they all produce successful nests. They've all fed babies out of that, out of those fields. And the really cool thing is, in 2024, when we found all these birds and we banded them all, we came back in 2025 and every single bird had returned to the field. And in most cases, the exact same territory that they were before, which is a great sign. It's called site fidelity. It means they're coming back to the exact same place because they like it, because they were successful there. And we also had a couple of these territories. So these territories that have these 2 little stars on them are polygynous males. So that's a male that had 2 different females on his territory. The red-winged blackbirds are really famous for that. Some red-winged blackbird males can attract like 20 females to their territories. The bobolinks don't do that to quite that extent, but they can attract 2 or 3 females. And if you see that in your habitat, that's another good sign that the habitat is really productive, that it can sustain multiple females at one territory. And so the fact is these birds are doing so well, and the same birds came back. Every single bird came back in that second year is mind-boggling if you think about the migratory journey that these birds took. So in the winter, these birds are in Peregrine, okay? So that's a 10,000-mile round trip that a bird bred successfully in that little field up in Fallbrook, flew down to Peregrine, came back the next May, and went right back to the exact same field. And so we're really encouraged by that as a positive sign. That this population is healthy, and we're doing a little bit that we can to help out this species that across its range is not doing very well because of the loss of grasslands around the country.
Do you have mountain larks there also?
Yes and no. I've never seen them breeding in there. Seen them kind of hanging out in there. I'd be interested to see if maybe you can get a couple breeding there this summer.
Are bobolinks back yet?
Not quite. No, they still a few weeks ago. They're sort of late April, early May.
How quickly would you expect the population to increase if this is such a great spot?
The limiting factor for them is the size of the habitat. So if you're familiar with those fields at all, they're not very big. And so bobolinks are really true grassland birds. So they're used to being in wide open grasslands. So this is really right on the edge of what they will tolerate because of the edge effects of the woods being around those fields. You look at these maps, all the territories are all clustered right in the middle of the field. They'd much rather be along the road than they would near the edge of the forests because they evolved in habitat with treeless habitats, essentially true grasslands, right? So that's the thing that limits. They can only pack so many into this field just because of the size.
How many acres is that field?
Yeah, that's a good question. That's like on the order of like 2 to 4 acres.
Oh, wow, it's
Like
very
that.
small.
It's small. It's pretty small. So it's really just about as small as much smaller than you probably wouldn't buy. So just enough to give them a little toehold. But
How does it compare to, say, in Paraguay? No idea what the grass.
yeah, down there they use, yes, they use grasslands, but they also use agricultural fields down there, but much more wide open habitat.
You know whether the
Yeah,
babies
question.
are coming back here?
That's a great question. We haven't seen that yet. Probably because there's no vacancies. All the adults come back, take over all the territories. So oftentimes what will happen is a baby might come back, fly over the field and see mom and dad and my uncle, my aunt, my cousins, and everybody's already there. I need to fly to the next field, right? So that would be really wonderful to see is if we get some babies to come back. But it would probably need a little territory vacancy.
So we've been reading Douglas Talmay, whose idea of saving the world is that everybody has a small garden.
Mhm.
I'm inclined to stop. We have maybe 5 or 6 acres by the lake, and I'm inclined to stop mowing. With that help the bird population. He thinks that insects respond.
Undoubtedly, yes.
Undoubtedly.
It would be a boom, especially with a patch, that big. Just about the worst thing you could do for birds is mow your grass. Just in terms of, reducing potential places where they could put nests, reducing the diversity of insects that are going to be in that grass for them to eat. Yes, absolutely. And, I think the moral of the story here with the bobolinks is, even just little patches here and there add up over time, right? So we're really struggling to replicate these massive, wide open grasslands that are all now cornfields and soy fields and everything. But if we can, string together a few little patches like this, little backyards, that can add up and make a difference.
Does it help to put up little houses for, say, carpenter bees or something?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Native insects are really the food source that's really lacking And there's all kinds of research that shows that just that having a diversity of vegetation in your yard is good. Certainly having native vegetation, right? So grass is not good. Tall grass is better than short grass, but even better than that is getting rid of your grass and planting either native grasses, native flowers, native shrubs. But there's, it's baby steps. So baby step you can take is definitely, if you can start to devote some of your lawn to, growing up and getting taller and other things mixing in there. You never know what sort of pioneer species will come in. It's much better for all the wildlife in your yard compared to the movie.
Well, we get honeysuckle, poison ivy, and I know they like poison.
Yeah.
And multiflora. So,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, even the Fallbrook field out here, you can't just let it grow indefinitely because of invasives and woody things will move in. So they still mow the field once a year to keep, to sort of prevent the succession getting in the hand. So sometimes it still does involve some management. You can't just totally just let it go forever because it'll get taken over by multiflora rows and things like that. But it's better than a mowed lawn. Any other questions about the bird stuff we're doing or how folks can get involved? Yeah.
So I was actually going to ask about the multiflora rose and if that has to do with the lack of honeysuckle, because I know we have a major overpopulation in Rice Creek.
That's an interesting question. That's a question for Dr. Hellquist. You have a dearth of honeysuckle. Will multiflora rose take advantage of that? I mean, it seems like we have plenty of both.
Yeah, off the top of my head, I don't know of any studies that have looked at competitive relationships between the two. They like the same sorts of habitats, so they like wet, moist, sea, forested soil. So they're definitely interacting together at the same place and time, but I don't know of any studies that indicate one has a competitive advantage of the other.
Yeah, and incidentally, the cardinals here love the multiflora rose, especially as a nesting substrate. So they'll put their nests in it. They love it, even though it's nasty stuff. But yeah, it's I don't mean to give the illusion that Rice Creek is this pristine, natural, wilderness. It is unfortunately, encroached upon by a lot of invasives as well, but not to the extent and not in the exact same way as an urban site is. Yeah.
So do cardinals they don't migrate from this area, do they?
No.
And
Nope.
neither do robins.
Robins are what we call facultative migrant, so which means they can or they can't. They're very sensitive to the conditions, the food supply. If the winter is kind of mild and there's still food around, they'll stay. If it's really harsh, they'll kind of slosh to the south a little bit. But cardinals do not move at all. Cardinal is going to spend its entire life in birds. Yeah.
I just wanted to tell you this little story that on February 9th, a saw-whet owl came and roosted on a magnolia tree in my backyard. It stayed there for 5 hours. I have a picture.
You saw it in the middle of the day?
It came at like 11 and
Yep.
afterwards at 4 something.
So you got very lucky. Yeah.
It was amazing.
And they, what our, little data set has shown is that they are around. They're not uncommon. They're just incredibly hard to detect. They're small, they're quiet. Usually during the day, they're just motionless, right? They're very camouflaged. So you just have to get lucky. You have to look up at the right time and see.
Well, my dog actually.
There you go.
Looking at where the dog was looking, he was looking down at my dog.
Yep. So just a teeny tiny little guy, right? Yep. Yeah. Yeah, and
I'm so excited.
they're around, but because they move quite a bit, most of the owls are not migratory either, right? The screech owls, the great horned owls, they're bigger, they're louder, so they're easier to detect, and they also just hang out in the same place year round. So people tend to know if there's a great horned owl in the backyard. Saw-whet owls are moving all around.
If this is February 9th, do you think it was migrating or was it?
February 9th is probably an overwintering bird. So that's one thing that we don't quite know about Rice Creek is if the birds are really just passing through or if some of them spend the winter here. They don't go very far south. They kind of go as far south as like mid-Atlantic kind of states, Tennessee, places like that. So there probably are some, especially if it's not a really nasty winter, that would overwinter here. Yeah. Yeah. Oh, that's a great observation. I've never seen one during the day. So you got very lucky. That's really cool.
Can you tell me, do different bird species understand what other birds might be, like if there's danger and they make different calls for different situations? Do other birds understand what's happening?
Yeah. The short answer is yes. Some birds are better at it than others, especially where we are in the winter. Think about what birds are doing in the winter. Most birds migrate, right? And leave. The birds that stay here in the winter often are forced to cooperate with each other, forced to interact with each other to survive. So they get together in mixed species flocks to forage for food because food is so hard to find that they have to get together, not just with individuals of their own species that they used to be competing with over the summer, but completely different species. In those cases, they've all evolved to be able to talk to each other.
Okay.
They can, and sometimes they divide up the labor in these flocks. One or two individuals will be sentinels. They'll be looking out for predators while everybody else is foraging. If they see a predator, they'll cheep, 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 and everybody else knows what that means.
Yeah, I was thinking more like the chickadees.
Yeah.
They have such different vocalizations for different. Then it's like, wow, okay, that means there's danger somewhere.
Yep.
Does everybody understand that? Hey guys.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah. A lot of them do. Yeah. They're pretty good at eavesdropping.
Oh, field deer. You see those? When we first moved here, I used to see them all the time, and they limp off to kind of protect their nest.
Mm-hmm.
I don't see them anymore.
Yeah, killdeer are, a lot of them pass through here on migration, and it is a population that's declining. So it definitely, I'm not surprised that you feel like you're seeing fewer than you used to. But that's a species that's never was super abundant around here. Yeah, you can see them when they are around. They're very obvious, they're loud, and they're one of these species that's not very fearful of people. They'll nest in like parking lots, or a couple of years ago up at Ontario Orchards, I went up there to buy some plants, and they had one that was nesting like right in their nursery, and they had like flags around it. It's like, where's the service berry? Like, it's over there. Make sure you don't step on the killdeer when you're on your way out. So you tend to know when they're around. Thank you so much, everybody, for your attention. And if you have any questions, find me later. And please, if you're interested at all in the banding station, shoot me an email, and you're more than welcome to come visit and get involved. Thank you.